Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Day one of practice in Bahrain is done, and yet again there is one car that looks like the rocket ship of the field, not just in race trim but also qualifying pace. The McLaren again, it seems like the car to beat by an absolute mile, but Lando Norris today making a rather remarkable claim, suggesting that if Max Verstappen was to step into the Red Bull, he would get out disappointed. Now, why would Lando say this, given all the context of the situation so far this season, especially on a weekend where it looks like McLaren are going to seriously stamp their authority on this championship? Very much intro to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. I greatly appreciate it. Plenty to start with today, and we're going to start here. This is Dan Fallows. He's going to be fired from Aston Martin. Now, he kind of already was. He was one of their top technical guys. He came in from Red Bull, and under his leadership, they went from being pretty good at the start of 2023 to absolutely nowhere as we presently stand. He was effectively demoted. Andy Cowell came in. But a couple of days ago, people spotted that on LinkedIn, he had ended his tenure with Aston Martin, he'd said that he didn't work there anymore. So I think it's pretty clear what that means. And there is now understanding that yes, Dan Fallows is getting fired effectively for all intents and purposes. V10 engines. We've talked a lot about this over the last couple of weeks, and today there was a summit, and a summit that some would describe as a crisis summit on the state of the 2026 regulations. Not necessarily around V10s, more so because there is serious concern from many of the manufacturers that effectively Mercedes are going to be so good that it's going to be impossible to compete. And we'll get to that in a second. And there was lots of, let's say, talk from the drivers on the likelihood of returning to a V10 or whether they would like it or not. You know, people are talking about V10s. To me, V10s, V8s, who really cares, in my opinion? It's more about, do we go back to a, naturally aspirated or turbocharged engine on sustainable fuels rather than sticking with the hybrid engines that we've had over the last few years? It would be lighter, it would make more sense, in my opinion. But, of course, the manufacturers may disagree. Sainz, Leclerc, Stroll, among others, are pretty happy and excited to go back to the V10s. This is what Leclerc says. What I've been seeing for next year is something that is not particularly exciting for me. And we'll say most of us share the same opinions. There's a real feeling that, at least in the simulator work, next year's V6 hybrid engines, but with the big hybrid component now, that effectively 50-50 that it's going to be, it's not really causing a lot of optimism, let's say, from the drivers and from the team. So today there was talk on a crisis meeting as engine civil war threatens to erupt. That is quite the title. I might need to take some notes. But so Mark Hughes talks about it here for Motorsport Magazine. The key takeaways, though, are that Mercedes presumes to be the leader right now going into 2026. Audi and Honda, two teams that are frankly only here making engines because of these regulations, have said, as frankly we all expect, no, we're not going back to V10s in 2026. Why would we do that? We've just pumped $300 million into the development of these, new hybrid engines for 2026. They say they don't want it until 2030, although there is discussion that the earliest date they will consider a change is 2029. 2028 would be too early just because, if you've got 2 years of a set of engine regulations, then, you're not really got any time to work on it, right? Because then you're already thinking about the next generation. So possibly 2029, they might change. There is a general feeling that there will never be, at least to keep the manufacturers interested, a fully ICE engine with no hybrid components. That was one of the key takeaways of the meeting today, that there will always have to be, for now anyway, some electrical component. So if we do V10s, if we do V8, that's not necessarily impossible, but if we do, there will be a small, kind of like they're doing WEC, there will be a small hybrid component that will be considered. That maybe is fine. As far as I'm concerned, that's okay. If we have V8s, but it's a little hybrid component and it's KERS that comes back or something, and we have 85-15, that's fine. And maybe that keeps the manufacturers happy. So I'm not sure that there won't be able to be a compromise that works for everyone, but there is a real feeling that 26, 27, 28 are going to be treacherous years for the sport in many respects. And have a look at this. Of the 5 engine manufacturers, one looks to be in good shape, Mercedes. There's a dearth of information about another. The biofuel choice made by one, with the other 4 opting for synthetic, is reportedly uncompetitive, and the remaining 2 PUs seem a long way behind. So we can just quickly try and speculate on this. So, which team do we not have much information on? You could argue that's Ferrari. It could be. We haven't really heard much about that. The 2 power units that seem a long way behind one of them is probably Red Bull, one of them is probably Audi. That's just my gut feel. But, Audi even said themselves they're going to be a long way behind. So I kind of doubt that's going to change. Honda is the interesting piece because theoretically I think Honda should be good. They've done a good engine for these regulations, but there were rumours that it's not so convincing. And the biofuel choice is interesting because they're partnering with Aramco Honda, and I imagine that would not be a biofuel. There was talk maybe it could even be the Shell biofuel that Ferrari might use. So who really knows? But the point is that Mercedes, McLaren, Williams and Alpine will be pretty happy, I think, seeing this news. So that's where we can leave it there for the day. We do also have some updates on Ferrari, some actual upgrades to the car. They brought some floor fences, floor body, floor edge diffuser, rear wing. This apparently was always an upgrade that they had planned for this particular weekend. They're bringing it to the car. Did it do much? I mean, well, we'll see. It's early days. Sometimes these upgrades take a while to bake in, but it's not like they brought the upgrade to the track and bang, the Ferrari is back, baby. These guys are back in P1. No, and frankly, nowhere near. And even Hamilton, look, I know that he probably sees as a bit of a stupid question, and I think it frankly probably is. But still, his answer doesn't exactly fill many with much confidence if you're, rooting for Hamilton at Ferrari to actually work as a partnership. Because, look, he won the sprint in China. That was a pretty amazing moment in the pole position there as well. But he was asked the question, what would you say to viewers waiting for something magical from you? And he says, yeah, don't. Simple as that. His point was, just watch and try and enjoy and, be along for the ride rather than having too many expectations, which I think the bottom line is for Hamilton that, the expectations right now at Ferrari aren't really there. Now, before we talk practice, Red Bull Verstappen related drama. So Tsunoda had a tricky day of practice today. That really should be no surprise. I personally think he is and will continue to be more competitive than Lawson in the Red Bull, but that does not mean that it's going to be easy by any means. And Tsunoda was talking about Max's setups on the car and just says, yeah, it's incredible that he's actually able to cope with that kind of setup because it just feels so tricky when I drive it. And the tricky thing that Tsunoda has to deal with is that when Max first joined Red Bull, he would just copy Ricciardo's setups, and that helped him, get a competent setup in the car that he could use and drive and, eventually understand what he wanted to do and to change to make them even better. The problem that any Red Bull driver has, you turn up to the team and you're like, okay, what car setup should I run? And they're like, oh yeah, maybe use Max's. And then you put Max's setup on the car and realize this is just not, humanly possible to drive unless you're Verstappen. At least if you drive it, you're either going to make a mistake at some point or you're going to have to drive somewhat within yourself. And eventually, Tsunoda will figure out setups that he likes and can also be fast. That's probably one of the main reasons why Red Bull want him in the car, is that they can actually do that. Find a way to get a setup that isn't Max's, which somebody else can actually handle. The problem is, Yuki said this as well today, they just have no idea what to change. He doesn't know what to change. The team doesn't really know what to change because they're trying to find a setup that he can work with that can still be fast. But he has no idea what to do yet anyway. He can't just follow Max's setups because they're Max's setups and they're not really built for, a driver that doesn't have the preferences that Max has. If there was a driver who was more traditional in Max's seat, it would make it easier for a second driver to come in. But in this case, it's just a real challenge. Now, Max was getting into it after the Japanese Grand Prix. He was asked the question about the McLaren. If you were in the McLaren, how would it have been today? And he said, I'd have been way up the road. You wouldn't have even seen me. Then people said, yes, Al, were you just joking about that? And Max says, did I stutter? I wasn't joking. No, you thought it was a joke? I'll give you an honest answer. I also said in that same interview that it wasn't going to happen anyway, right? As in getting in the McLaren. So Lando, as is, media brilliance really, was asked the question, yeah, well, if Max was in your car, he says that he'd be driving off into the sunset. What do you think about that? And of course, there's no good answer to this from Lando, but certainly his answer raised some eyebrows. So he said the following: I would love for him to come and test our car. I'll be excited to see the disappointment on his face after he gets out. So, the tricky thing for Lando is, with comments like this, is that it's impossible to win. Option one, which, he's kind of managed to do both options here. But option one is either you maybe disrespect Max's talent and ability. Lando, as talented as he is, he's not a four-time world champion, right? And Max has done that on a consecutive basis, and clearly for very good reason indeed. So either you're downplaying Max's talent and saying, yeah, if he drove the McLaren, he wouldn't be able to do any better of a job than I'm currently able to do, or which is effectively what he's done here, is disrespect to the engineers. At least this was how I would feel if I was an engineer. Like, if I'm an engineer, maybe I don't care, but if I'm an engineer and I'm hearing Lando say that my car would be disappointing to Max. This is a car that is currently leading the World Constructors' Championship, a car that is leading the World Drivers' Championship, a car that is the successor of a car that won last year's World Constructors' Championship, right? Like, this car is a good car. And Lando, we're going to see the results of practice today. And Lando's out here saying, yeah, Max would be super disappointed. I'm sure he's like semi-joking, I don't know. But, Max would be disappointed if he got out of our car because our car's, a disappointment. It's tricky to drive. Lando comes into this weekend saying, yeah, the car's a bit tricky. It's going to be problematic this weekend. It's not going to be so easy. And sure, the cars these days, so much downforce, but they have to really run on a knife's edge to get the performance out of them with the way that these Grand Effect era cars work. Sure, they're all not easy to drive. I think that even Red Bull said that. Yeah, the McLaren doesn't look the easiest car to drive, but it is most certainly the fastest. So, and many people are also looking at this and saying, well, what if Max did come and drive the car? What if Zach Brown said, you know what, Max, you want to do a test in the McLaren? Feel free. You can come and drive our machine. Now, they would never do this, but imagine that it happens, and then Max, is obviously flying potentially, and he's like, you know what, Lando, we think Oscar's the man for the job, and then all of a sudden things change around internally at the team. It's never going to happen, but you know what I'm saying anyway, right? So it's impossible for Lando to answer this question well. I mean, maybe he should just not have answered it. But, his answer just, raised questions, didn't it, once again? Especially when the McLaren is clearly the best car. Because the argument that Norris is trying to make is that the reason why McLaren are currently leading the championships is because of the great drivers that they have. And that is true in part. But the main reason why they're leading the championships is because of the car. And I don't think there's anyone right now in Formula 1 who is really going to deny that. So let's talk about practice. Thought this is pretty cool to see the cooling levels on the new Ferrari compared to what they were back in Japan, just to get a picture of what the weekend's going to look like. This was a crazy moment as well. So this is Luke Browning in the Williams, nearly flying into the side of Alex Albon. I think, look, you can blame the drivers here, but the team, Williams are historically a team that does not do a great job when it comes to telling their drivers where the other drivers are on the track. And the fact that he had to take evasive action here to avoid half of Williams' damage budget disappearing at a practice session because he was on a flyer and Albon wasn't able to get out the way in time. It was honestly a complete mess. FP1 was also kind of interesting. Sonoda was talking a lot about the throttle not reacting well. He was also talking, well, certainly Max later on, about the brakes not reacting well. So, difficult day for the drivability of the RB21. There was also this. So, unfortunately for Kimi Antonelli, he didn't really get any running in the first practice session because they had a leak. Chris Midland says they had a loss of water pressure in the car and it went into limp home mode. The team's trying to understand the cause. And they were trying to rip the back of the car off. I think they were trying to rip the gearbox away or something manually, and it wasn't really working out. So, it's DIY jobs over there at Mercedes. This is probably the most unrepresentative practice session you're ever really going to see. So, okay, look, there's so many grains of salt here that it's not really worth analysing FP1 at all. There was loads of rookies in the car, so I'm probably just going to leave it there, really. I'll just let you guys observe. FP2 was far more interesting, more representative conditions. The track was obviously gripping up a little bit, and they were starting to put in some serious lap time. So Hamilton at this point, with 40 minutes on the clock, went, wow, P1, Ferrari are back, baby. But, no, Ferrari are most certainly not back. There was also this insane moment. Poor Alonso, man. He's had a really rough start to the season, and then he's trying to turn into, what is this? Turn 4, and his steering wheel just comes off the car. It literally came off. He didn't really exactly say it on the radio, but maybe he pulled it off to try and fix an issue. But the steering wheel just comes off the mount, and then he plugs it back in and finishes out the lap. So that was certainly a moment of all time. But then we had this. So Albon went fastest over both of the Ferraris, and that was already a bit of, alarm bells ringing, I'd imagine, over there at Maranello, and of course in the garage in Bahrain. And then Verstappen goes top, and Verstappen's lap looked okay. Watching his onboards, a couple of tricky moments, but it didn't really seem like it was especially fast. It was purple. Wow, it must be fast. But it didn't, the onboard didn't exactly look spectacular. And I think we saw that when Lando Norris came around the corner and dunked 7/10 on Max. So this is apparently the car that Max would be disappointed to drive. Let's be real for just a couple of seconds here. So Lando puts in a purple middle sector. And by the way, that middle sector for the McLaren, it was the same story actually in testing here. Their straight line speed, they tend to run more downforce, McLaren. This is the same thing that Red Bull used to do when they had a dominant machine in 2023. They'd run more downforce, except the fact that their straight line speed wouldn't be as good, but you protect the tyres better, and it really helps you over a race stint. And if you can get away with it because your car's quick enough anyway, then it's great. And I mean, they were putting 7/10 on the field in the middle sector alone. Like, that's how absurd it was. First and third sector, fine, normal enough compared to the rest of the field. All of the time McLaren gained was in the middle sector, the twisty parts, really. And it's just bonkers how much performance they have there compared to anybody else. The funny thing is, of course, that Piastri decided to go even faster. And Piastri put in a lap that was a 10th.5 up on Lando. And already this is a fascinating story to me. This Oscar versus Lando dynamic this season. Look, Lando had his number last year for sure, but it seems like this car and some of its characteristics, they play a little bit more into Piastri's hands. Piastri's getting better. Obviously, Norris is the championship favourite, championship leader. There's going to be pressure attached to that. Piastri, to me, is better at managing the pressure. Is he the faster driver? No, not as far as I'm concerned. But it does seem like this car allows Piastri to get very close to Norris in pure pace and then maybe even take advantage of, in my opinion, the superior mental characteristics that he holds. So Piastri, I mean, let's practice, right? But he nails another 10th.5 on Lando. Then we see the two Mercedes. I mean, Russell's lap, I imagine Russell thought that lap was pretty damn good, and Antonelli was only a couple of tenths behind too, but they were just half a second off, and Russell was losing 7/10 to Piastri in the middle sector. Like, that is absurd. And pretty much the same continued for the rest of practice. Notable that Hadjar went ahead of Verstappen, but also worth noting that in all of these sections where effectively power is important, that's where Hadjar was faster. So it's almost certain that there is some great degree of engine performance advantage that Hadjar was gaining there to give him an overall lap time advantage. And then towards the end of the session, Hamilton goes out and he had a good lap on the go. Hamilton, after the first two sectors, was only a 10th down on Piastri. And so it looked like Hamilton was going to be able to put in a time right there with Lando, maybe just behind, slot into third. And it seems like the performance in the car was there. But then Hamilton's final sector was a nightmare. He couldn't get any rotation, understeering like crazy into the final couple of corners. And it just felt like for the Ferrari, the performance is there for two sectors, but if you push too hard, the tyres overheat and your third sector is nowhere. So he lost a second in the final sector. So it's not like Hamilton Ferrari didn't have the pace at times, but they simply couldn't put together a full lap like McLaren did, and that was, the real detriment for them. Hamilton was struggling with the magic button as well, and that would be traumatizing to some. And at the end, it was pretty interesting, so we got to see some long runs. Verstappen was on like his 15th lap on these soft tyres, was struggling heavily. He had a bit of beefing with Russell really here on the track, as Russell eventually got the job done, and Piastri got the pass as well. Here it is then, the long run data that we can take away from this session, and I mean, all we can really say is that it's pretty clear McLaren are the team to beat, and by an absolute mile. Piastri's average on the hard tyres, we're talking about a 1:38.0. On the softs, he did fewer laps, but he was averaging a 1:37.0. Lando was averaging a 1:38.2 on the softs in a bit of a longer stint. Russell was a few tenths back on that. Leclerc was a few tenths back on that. Antonelli, Hamilton, Verstappen, Tsunoda. Tsunoda was even way further behind. He seems to be struggling, and I'm not frankly surprised with the way that car presently is. But everyone was at least half a second off where the McLaren could potentially be. And you've got to think that the degradation there on the McLaren is going to be even stronger than many of the rivals. So not many people are going to doubt right now that McLaren should be on the front row tomorrow for qualifying. They frankly should lock it out on the performance advantage we saw today. And frankly, they should 1-2 the Grand Prix weekend. If they do not, I will be surprised. They dominated here in practice. They dominated here in testing a few weeks ago. It should be perfect for McLaren to execute. Where Verstappen, if Verstappen can limit the damage as much as possible, that is surely his goal this weekend. But for now, it's looking like he most certainly would prefer to be in that McLaren, even if Lando feels differently. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.